Welcome to today's Pensions and Lifetime Savings Association webinar, where we have a Q&A with David Deferreds, Executive Director of the Pensions Regulator. My name is Rachel Pine, and I look after content for the PLSA's conferences and training. We're really pleased to have David with us today to answer questions from the UK's pensions community. With more than 400 people registered for this webinar, it's evident that many of you are keenly interested in what David has to say. As the COVID-19 pandemic took hold, the Pensions Regulator looked at the key risks to the nation's schemes and began putting guidance together to help them. The guidance continues to evolve as the economic impact becomes clearer. On today's webinar, David will speak briefly about guidance for DB schemes, including the LGPS, DC, including master trusts, employer guidance about auto-enrollment, and he'll also talk about TPR's messages for savers. We're hoping to have lots of questions from you. To start off, we're having a couple of polls that will let us all see how you're thinking. May we have the first poll, please? Since the start of the pandemic, would you say the Pensions Regulator's guidance has been very helpful, quite helpful, not helpful, or you don't know? Okay, so it looks as if broadly, quite helpful. So nearly 2/3, 61% of people feel the Pensions Regulator has been quite helpful, with 29% very helpful, 2% not helpful, and 7% don't know. So that's good. And for the second poll, if we can see the second poll, please. Second poll looks at specific areas where you'd like more guidance. So in which areas would you like more guidance from the Pensions Regulator? On this one, you can tick all that apply. All right, seems the voting's concluded. It looks like most people want to hear about DB funding, followed closely by obligations on employers in the context of furlough, then tied for third, DB transfers and member comms, and then we go to DC contributions, late payments, DC investment, core admin, and other. I think I got them all. So I think that gives us a really good idea of how people are thinking and what maybe can frame the conversation today. And thanks to all of you who participated. It's great to know how you're thinking. I'm very pleased to now introduce Nigel Peaple, the PLSA's Director of Policy and Research, and David Deferreds, Executive Director of the Pensions Regulator. Please keep sending in questions. If they're not answered in today's session, we'll be sending them to David for a follow-up. Now I'm going to turn this over to our chair, Nigel Peaple.
Thanks, Rachel. Well, greetings, everybody. And thank you very much again to David for agreeing to join with us and to be grilled by well over 300 participants at present. So we're looking forward to that.
Thank you, Nigel. In the Pensions Regulator, obviously we've had to adapt to this quite difficult situation and move ourselves to working in a very virtual environment. We've looked at prioritising our activities under three main areas that are there on the slide: operational, short-term financial stress, and the perspective of savers. Pretty much everything actually that we've done has had savers' interests at heart. In terms of operational issues, we were very clear that what we wanted trustees and particularly administrators to do were focus on some critical things. So where pensions are in payment, that those pensions in payment continue to be paid, where beneficiaries need to receive payments, and again that those were prioritised, but also where money was being invested from individuals' pay packets, we wanted to make sure that that was being passed on to investment managers and being invested in a timely fashion. So we asked trustees and administrators to prioritise their activities, to look at all the things that were critical and put those ahead of perhaps some of the more bureaucratic items. And we said that we would take a very proportionate response to people that couldn't fulfil all their duties. The second thing we did was try to help the pensions community, trustees, etc., by not introducing any new consultations or requirements, and to provide some easements to some reporting requirements. So recognising that it may not be possible to get accounts completed on time, may not be possible for benefit statements to be issued. And in subsequent guidance, we've given people broadly, in most cases, 3 months. Where an activity can be put right within 3 months, then we've said that we won't take any action. So we've been trying to help organisations operationally. We know that in the early days there were some issues with some administrators looking to work remotely. They were actually not set up to do that as well as they might, and struggled initially. And also where some services have been outsourced, particularly to other countries, that there were some challenges. But we're really keen that operationally the right things were prioritised and dealt with in that way. Now, clearly, when the pandemic broke and companies were in lockdown, we did get requirements to ease up and provide some short-term financial easements to organisations. But it's probably worth saying that in terms of looking at the landscape, we were getting relatively few requests come in to suspend deficit contributions. Probably experience today talking to professional trustees, advisors, covenant advisors, is that it's around 5 to 10% of companies that have got real financial short-term pressures. So we were not inclined to provide easements right across the piece, but we did want to provide some assistance to those companies that are really struggling in this environment. And so we set out in our guidance that where trustees got requests from employers to suspend deficit contributions, they could do that in the short term. We did expect employers to provide trustees with appropriate information for them to form a judgment. But overall, we wanted the pension scheme to be treated fairly with other stakeholders and creditors. On automatic enrolment, we still do think that it's really important that contributions continue to be paid and invested on members' behalf. So we have not provided any relaxation, government's not provided any relaxation in terms of automatic enrolment itself. And I think to some degree that's been helped by the furlough scheme. So where employees are furloughed, obviously they can turn to government to recoup costs, and government has clarified that it will meet the employer automatic enrolment contributions. So where employees are being furloughed, we provided help in organisations being able to reduce contributions to that which they're getting paid for by or reimbursed by government. And then the savers perspective. And I think there are two real perspectives here. There are those people who are perhaps quite some way from retirement, where the right thing to do is to continue saving for money to be invested, particularly at this time. If markets recover, then contributions invested on behalf of members could be particularly valuable. But secondly, we recognise that for some members who are coming up to retirement, about to make quite critical decisions, then they really need to think quite carefully about those decisions and seek help. So we have asked employers and trustees to support members if they have those life-changing decisions, to point them to guidance on the Money and Pension Service and the guidance that they're able to provide there. And tomorrow we'll be issuing on our website some further guidance for employers and trustees on how they could communicate to members and how they could help members. And then just lastly, sadly, when we're in difficult situations like this, scammers do look to take advantage of these difficult situations. So we want trustees and employers to make members aware that they potentially are subject to scam, to point them to the Scam Smart website where they can get further information, and again to the Money and Pension Service, which has got some quite good assistance. So in all our decisions, what we have tried to do is look at the perspective of members, those quite some way from retirement, those approaching retirement, And in terms of the easements, we've thought about what the impact is from members. So where we've provided easements, that's largely because we don't think there's any detriment to members, to savers. And where we perhaps haven't provided an easement where people might expect it is because we think it may be detrimental to savers. So, Nigel, that's a broad overview of how we've approached this.
Yes, thanks very much, David. We've already got 19 questions in. I'm proposing that we try and take those as we go through the detailed areas, but there are a couple of overarching questions that strike me as relevant for you to pick up now. One of them is quite an easy one, which was the observation that over the last few weeks, often the guidance has come out Friday evening. I think you've got some plans in that place. I wonder if you could answer that, and then I'll go on to the next question.
I missed some of the question, but I think the first two pieces of guidance tended to come out at 5:30, something like that, on a Friday evening. And I have to apologise for that. A few journalists commented that that was quite tricky for them to have to write up their stories on Friday evening. What we were really keen to do is to get guidance out as quickly as we could, but also that the guidance that we were putting out was consistent with the way that other regulators, the FCA, the PRA, were looking at issues, and also that we were acting in line with government intentions in those areas. So it did mean, sadly, in terms of those first bits of guidance, that they did come out quite late on Friday. I have to say, even though they did come out quite late, we had quite a lot of hits on the website of people reading that information. And in some cases, people said it was quite helpful to have the weekend to digest some of the guidance that we have been given. But going forward, we are trying to avoid the 5 o'clock, 5:30. We have got some guidance coming out tomorrow, as I say, which is on communicating with members. That will include a letter that for members who are looking to transfer benefits, we think it would be quite helpful for trustees to send that letter to them, things that they could think about. And then on Thursday this week, we're hoping to publish our annual funding statement. So we are desperately trying to avoid that Friday evening print.
Thank you, David. And you anticipated my second question. Was somebody's written in saying, what other guidance have you got planned? And you've mentioned 2. Is there anything else that we should be aware of just before we dip down and get into the detail of what's already been said?
So within the Pensions Regulator, each Monday lunchtime, we have an update in terms of requests for clarification that have come in. We have our own intelligence update of what's happening within the marketplace, and we make decisions then on what guidance we're going to publish either that week or in subsequent weeks. So as we get requests for clarifications, for further guidance, we consider those and put them into the machinery to do that. So it's likely that we'll continue to issue guidance, potentially not in the depth and the frequency that we have done to date. We think we've hit quite a lot of the key questions that people have been asking us, but we'll continue to provide updates for as long as this situation persists and as long as we think it's helpful and people find it helpful.
Thank you, David. And I'm aware you can't see me nodding because due to problems with my signal, we've switched my video off.
I mean, I think it's a pretty mixed picture. So we have had contact with most of the key administrators. We did want to make sure that operationally that they could continue to pay benefits and they were operational and they were adapting to working remotely. Mostly that is the case. Most have said that. 1 or 2 were having to buy in extra equipment and so on to deal with that. I mean, I think probably one of the biggest challenges is there's really quite a mixed picture. So in terms of defined benefit pension schemes, a really small number have found that their funding levels actually improved as we've gone through this crisis. Many, I think, potentially learning from post-2008, where they've hedged quite well some of the risks within their pension scheme, have not seen significant drops in funding levels and are coming through this crisis in pretty good form, even if they've actually got actual valuations at March, April this year. And then a few who've not hedged risk and potentially got quite a heavy mismatch are potentially seeing quite dramatic falls in funding levels. So maybe of the order of 30%. So real different experience in terms of pension schemes themselves. In terms of employers, the intelligence that we're gathering suggests that around 5%, maybe up to 10% of employers are approaching trustees to ask for suspension of contributions. The longer I think that we stay in this lockdown, we're expecting that number to potentially increase, but a lot of employers actually saying that they are in a good place and they're working through this. Then on the defined contribution side, we're doing two things. We're monitoring the number of members that are opting out. I think with job security perhaps being more challenging in this environment, we potentially would expect the number of deferred members to increase. So we're looking at also at number of opt-outs where individuals are finding financial circumstances difficult. And we're also monitoring very carefully compliance with automatic enrolment duties. So we have chosen, government's chosen not to suspend automatic enrolment duties. We are expecting employers to continue to comply.
Thank you, David. No, that's fine. I am aware that I'm having, that people are not always able to hear me, but I just wanted to say briefly before moving on, just say that the PLSA has been surveying our membership on their confidence in their ability to continue to deliver and pay benefits, in their confidence in their contingency plans, which they've now adopted. And so far, we're finding it's a very positive response. Now, that might be something about PLSA members or PLSA members who fill in surveys, but it is an encouraging sign, and we'll be publishing those findings and some other ones on Thursday. David, I suggest now you go on to talk about your first topic area, and then at the end of that, we can dip into the Q&As that are mounting up, and we can select out some of the answers being raised. Just so you know, I'm going to attempt to dial off this connection whilst you're talking and to try and dial on via a different telephone link, and we'll see how well that works. If it doesn't work well, you'll be hearing more from Rachel than from me. Okay, over to you, David, on your next slide.
So I think the next slide is defined benefit scheme. So as I said at the beginning, the intelligence that we're getting is that there's a relatively small number of organisations, perhaps 5 to 10%, who are really struggling in terms of paying deficit repair contributions. So we recognise that those companies really do need help. We do believe quite strongly that the best support for a pension scheme is a profitable and sustainable employer. So we did want to help those companies that have got short-term financial issues get their way through this lockdown, this pandemic crisis. So we set out within our guidance the conditions that we thought it would be appropriate for trustees to agree to a suspension or deferral of deficit contributions, but also set out for employers the sorts of information that they need to provide. In terms of 2019 valuations, a number of schemes are coming up to their 15-month deadline. We did say within our guidance that we didn't expect trustees to revisit some of the assumptions in that valuation, but we did think it was appropriate that they looked at the sponsor covenant and how that might be impacted by COVID before finalising their valuation. And in order to give trustees some time, we gave a 3-month extension to the usual 15-month time period to complete actuarial valuations. So that's 2019 valuations. 2020 valuations, we've got our annual funding statement, which so we'll hope to publish on Thursday. For those schemes, as at January, in more benign conditions, we are suggesting that they take into account some of the post-valuation experience. We're not really in favour of those schemes with end of March, April valuation deadlines, accelerating the valuation to a more benign period. But within the annual funding statement, we set out the steps and sorts of things that we expect trustees and employers to consider in tackling their actuarial valuation. Lastly, let me just pick up on the funding code. The funding code, I mean, interestingly enough, largely is a balance between member security and affordability, and that really is quite pertinent to the environment that we're in. But the funding code and with the pension schemes bill is really looking for schemes to set a long-term objective by the time that they reach a high state of maturity, and for schemes at that point to have a low dependency on their employer and on their investment strategy. So we think a long-term destination is still appropriate. Setting a journey plan on how to get there, again, is fully appropriate. It's just really unfortunate the beginning of that journey potentially is a little bit rockier than we'd anticipated when we launched the funding code. But quite interestingly, sustainable investment risk and visibility of covenant, 2 areas that we cover in the funding code, which are absolutely pertinent to the environment that we're in at the moment. So we still think the funding code is right. The principles there, actually, if anything, have been really supported and emphasised by the crisis that we're going through. But we did recognise that it's quite challenging for trustees, advisors, employers to meet our original timescale for the funding code. So we have extended that out to September of this year, so people can fully participate in that. But they should expect that we'll press ahead with our first consultation leading into the second consultation. And we're hoping that we'll have the code in place for January 2022 valuations, although recognising quite difficult times. You're back now, Nigel. Good.
Thanks, David. I'm back. I'm back on a telephone call. Hopefully people can hear me. No doubt lots of people will tell me if I'm not clear. But David, I thought, thank you very much for introducing a perspective on DB. Now seems like a good time to switch to some of the questions that people have been sending in, and we can focus particularly on the DB ones. And due to the wonders of this system, as you know, popular questions can get voted and liked up to the top of the list. So I thought we might take the top few. And basically speaking, the first question I'd like to ask is quite a thorny one, and it's to do with the pension schemes bill and the extension of powers in that. So I will perhaps read out the question. It's quite long, but I'll read out the question so everybody can hear it. Hi, I think we all expect corporate restructurings to be necessary as the effects of the pandemic continue to play out. I'm interested to know how you think the regulator's new powers in the pension schemes bill might have impacted the ability or the willingness to attempt restructurings had they already been in place now. Should this give legislators any pause for thought when they return to looking at the bill? And as you know, David, this is something that a lot of people in the industry have been worried about, the broad extension of the powers, and indeed we've talked about it in recent weeks ourselves. David.
So my understanding is the government is still pressing ahead with the pension schemes bill and expecting it to move to the next stage in May, and for all the current elements that are within the pension schemes bill to move forward. Although I think we'll probably have to see about the implementation of some of those, or whether COVID has pushed out some of the timescales. But I think what you're really referring to there is 107, which introduces criminal powers under a 3-step process, but also It's not to individuals that are directly connected to pension schemes. It could be anybody that has an impact on accrued benefits, that they knew that their actions could have an impact on accrued benefits, and they didn't have a reasonable excuse for doing so. I think this is one of those things that's quite challenging. I think that clause is deliberately drafted quite wide, so that it can capture the most egregious behaviour that we sometimes see. And so I think there's a real challenge in balancing, ensuring that you can use that piece of legislation when you need to do it, but also I understand that it does give some concerns that people might innocuously feel that they get caught by that clause. What I will say is it's a criminal sanction. The bar for criminal action is quite hard, and so it is likely to be the most egregious behaviour that gets caught. So I'm not aware that the government is looking to change that clause. As I say, I think it's intentionally drawn quite wide to ensure it can do what it was intended to do.
Thanks, David. I expect we'll go on talking to DWP and indeed parliamentarians about that clause. I'm going to jump ahead now to a question which is from David Holloway. So I hope he intended to give his name in. Due to the potential uncertainty with respect to the financial situation of the supporting employer, is there any extension to the normal deadline by which pension scheme accounts need to be audited and signed off?
So I think the FRC has given some leeway there, and we have said that we won't take action where there have been delays down to COVID. So I think within our guidance we've already set out the instruments that we've given.
And here's a bit of a different type question from Judith Coding. Have you seen any really good examples of governance in recent weeks through either your one-to-one supervision calls or your other engagement with schemes? Is there anything that stands out as being effective, perhaps?
Yeah, actually, in the very early days of the lockdown, we did see some really good examples of people changing their risk register, looking at all the issues. In many ways, what we set out in our guidance that schemes should prioritise their activities. Actually, we did see some really good examples of schemes looking to understand where their risks were operational, whether they might have liquidity challenges, the sorts of things that could impact on liquidity. So yeah, we have seen some very good examples actually.
Thanks. And then we've got a few questions around assessing the strength of the employer covenant. Stephen Ellaby has said, how will TPR deal with COVID in terms of assessing the strengths of the employer covenant? And Bob Granger's said, is the regulator going to take a different view on employer covenant assessments, quotes, tending to strong, etc., in the context of triennial valuations in the light of the pandemic crisis? So what's your view on the employer covenant and how to assess it?
Yeah, so it is one of the challenging things, I think, around this experience that companies are coming through this lockdown period with very different experiences. So there are some employers who are, their products are still in demand, they're still managing to meet that demand, and they're coming through in pretty good shape, and their covenant will remain strong. Equally, there are those that are really struggling. And for some of those that are struggling, it may take some time for us to come out of the current situation, for the economy to return back to normal, to understand how they're going to fare. And to be really clear, we don't have any better idea of what may impact, what the outcome might be for the economy, for particular businesses than anybody else. I think a lot of companies are looking at scenarios of how they might come out of this crisis, what that might mean for their business when they might return to a degree of normality. And it may well be that there isn't an absolute view of covenant, but there are a range of outcomes that could be there. which corporates will need to carefully explain to trustees the kind of critical risks to their business and what they need to be in place in order for them to go forward. So it's really sharing information, I think, with trustees by corporates on their own particular circumstances.
Thanks, David. And then another popular DB-focused question is from Andy Thompson. There are over 2,000 DB schemes with fewer than 100 members. What pragmatic solutions are proposed for the trustees of these smaller schemes to deal with distressed employers without incurring excessive costs for legal, actuarial, and covenant advice? Tricky one. What's your view, David?
Yeah, so we do cover this in the annual funding statement. Clearly, the resources that are available to those smaller employers are not as great. Their budget's not as great. They potentially can't look at as many scenarios or in a sophisticated way as larger employers. We are asking advisors to help those trustees that have got smaller schemes to try and deal with the uncertainty in as cost-effective way as they can.
Okay, now I should say that we are planning with David to try and respond to all the questions in writing after, not immediately after, but over the next week or so. So we probably won't have time to ask all the questions that are getting raised, but that you will get an answer in due course. I think now, after that very quick shot round some DB issues, we probably ought to move on really to the next focus area, which of course is DC. David, so new slide, please.
Yeah, as I said at the beginning, there are probably two groups of individuals, those that are some way from retirement, where we want them to encourage to save for retirement, we want employers to continue investing on members' behalf, and those coming up to retirement potentially, or have got difficult decisions because they're thinking about transferring, and markets are currently very volatile and uncertain. So we are, as I said, producing some more guidance which will come out tomorrow on how we want trustees, employers to communicate with individuals. We perhaps haven't quite given as many easements in this area as we have in others, largely because we think the value of schemes paid at this particular moment are particularly important if markets return to normal. So we haven't provided easements on the 60-day consultation to reduce contributions, except in the case of furloughed employees. Really, we want money to be invested on members' behalf timely and appropriately. I touched on scam activity. We do seem to have had variable experience. A lot of pension schemes seeing a slight decline in transfer requests, but one or two trustees tell us that they're seeing quite a significant uptick, and in some cases they suspect it may be due to scam activity. So encourage employers, trustees to be really aware that there are scammers out there looking to tempt members to transfer to what they say is a much safer place for their retirement savings, because they'll probably never see those savings again. So really encouragement to point members towards Scam Smart website and the advice that's on the Money and Pension Service. In terms of master trusts, again, we probably provided less relief and easement. We are aware that master trusts are the vehicle of choice for a very high proportion of members in terms of saving for retirement. So we are particularly careful not to provide easements that would either blindside us to things that are going on within master trusts. We probably provided less easements because we think it's really important that master trusts continue to deliver for members. We are in dialogue with all the master trusts on how they're coping with COVID-19, understand the pressures that they're under, and it's something that we're monitoring really carefully.
Thanks, David. I'm just surveying the 30-odd questions that we've got in here to see if there's any DC-specific ones. I haven't spotted one yet. Some are to do with communications with savers and key messages, which you touched upon there, and I think you're going to say a little bit more about afterwards. I don't know, David, whether you're also having a glance at the questions, but I'm just seeing if we can't see any specific ones, we'll move on to the next subject area. Right, so I can't see them now. So if I see one after your next block of information, we'll come back to that. The next focus area is on employers, and of course there are lots of interlinkages between employers and DB and DC, and some of the questions sort of on DC are really about employers. So I think we'll let you go and talk about that now, David, and in that case I'd like the next slide up. Thank you.
So as I say, we're acutely aware that some organisations are under enormous financial pressures, and we try to provide easement for those in terms of short-term easement for deficit contributions. For those schemes that have got actuarial valuations at March, April, indeed in January, we recognise that those short-term financial pressures may bring to bear in terms of what they can afford by way of contributions, particularly if deficits have increased at the valuation this year. We are looking for trustees to structure deficit repair plans in such a way that it can balance the easement to employees, but not jeopardise the security of members. So it may well be that for recovery plans that are decided this year, there's some step up in contributions, or there are some triggers which might trigger higher levels of contributions, but recognising that we're in a period of quite high uncertainty. Automatic enrolment duties I've touched on. We've not really provided any easements there apart from in reporting and some of those duties, except where there are furloughed employees. And as I said, we're issuing further guidance tomorrow on what we're expecting employers to do in terms of providing support and communicating to members.
Thanks, David. And one question that's just come in, which is on this issue of AE duties, I think from Dinah McDonald, will you provide guidance on practical issues such as certification on the alternative sets or options if employers reduce contributions? So that's
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. And so for normal DC members, we're expecting them to go through a 60-day consultation if they want to reduce contributions. For employees who are being furloughed, then we are accepting that they may reduce contributions just to the amount that's being reimbursed by government, but they can't reduce contributions below those that are required for automatic enrolment purposes.
Fine, so we'll come back to that issue of exactly which aspect of certification we were getting into. Okay, thank you, David. So I'm just looking up, I know there's some other questions, I saw them before, on AE issues. If not, we'll move on, but I know they're here. Dum-de-dum-de-dum.
There are some particularly complex issues around salary sacrifice, and we have provided some guidance and some examples on how to deal with salary sacrifice, because we know that was one of the quite challenging things about the arrangement the government's put in place of how that operates with salary sacrifice arrangements.
Okay, great. And indeed, that was something we were hearing from our members separately about the need for extra support on making sense of the salary sacrifice rules. Okay, so I think it probably makes sense to move on briefly. You were going to say a few more words, I think, about communicating with savers. We're not using a slide for this one. You've probably covered a lot of the issues already, but I suggest you perhaps run through your key points on that, and then we dip in generally to the questions that people have raised. Over to you again, David.
Yeah, so I think I have covered a lot of those. Clearly, for members who are getting annual benefit statements as at March, April, they could well see quite significant drops in the value of their savings, and it would be fantastic if trustees communicated and encouraged individuals, notwithstanding that fall, to continue to save for their retirement, but to put those drops in value in the context of what it might mean for their overall retirement. So if individuals continue to save and invest, then actually this may be a particularly good time to have paid contributions into their pension scheme. So helping members understand that position, but also really for those individuals who are making difficult decisions, that might be life-changing decisions, they take a step back, they think about what they're about to do, they have a look at the Money and Pensions website, they seek support from the Money and Pension Service if appropriate, but really helping members through that and making sure they don't make a decision which they come to regret in due course.
Okay, I noticed not on the Q&A but on the chat line, somebody just asked a question about whether it's a DC question, whether TPR will be looking closely at how default funds weather this current economic climate. Do you have any thoughts on how you'll be looking at those in the future?
Yeah, so in the guidance that we put out in March, we put some thoughts that we had around investments more generally. Quite a heavy focus on liquidity to make sure that pensions in payment can be paid. We know that there are some challenges around liquidity in some areas. But we also looked at the sorts of investment triggers that trustees may have put in place, whether to rebalance funds, triggers to de-risk, and so on. And we'll be particularly looking at default funds within master trusts and seeing how they're tackling with the challenges that we're in at the moment. So if you're a master trust and you've not heard from us, you are likely to hear that we'd very much welcome discussions on any changes to default funds that master trusts are intending to make.
Of course, one challenge with assessing investment generally in DC in particular is the fact that it might be many years before we know whether the calls being made last year and now are the right ones. But no doubt TPR will be with us for some years, so that's something we can all do together. Just switch off now to a bit of a different general question for a moment. Someone's written in saying easements are in place until the end of June. Does TPR have a date by which they will review whether this date will be extended? David.
So towards the end of May, early June, we'll be looking at all the easements that we've given, and we'll be deciding whether those easements should come to an end or whether it's appropriate to continue to extend those. And we'll be doing that on an easement by easement basis, if you like. So yes, it's something that we have got scheduled that we need to look at.
Thank you. And here's another very real world covenant assessment question. If a scheme has to submit the valuation by the 30th of June, do you expect an external covenant assessment to be undertaken, even though the employer and the covenant assessor does not really know how and when they will recover from the lockdown yet? So it's all to do with our current great uncertainty about the impact on sponsors and business in general.
Yeah, so we recognise that this is a really challenging time. Within the annual funding statement, which I say we'll publish on Thursday, we do set out how we think covenant assessment could and should take place. I mean, I think if you have an employer that's in distress, it might be particularly important to get external advice, quite specialised advice, on the choices that people make. You know, in a very binary way, you could find that your employer fails, becomes insolvent, and then things like guarantees or support mechanisms could be particularly important. That's one of the reasons why we haven't, or we've set out that trustees should think really carefully before they give up that support or guarantees that are in place. or an employer will come out of this and begin to get itself back on its feet and begin to thrive. And you know, we're saying that trustees should be supportive of that, but equally they have to be treated fairly with other stakeholders. So I think there are things you can do. I think if you're in a particularly challenging situation, then getting appropriate expert advice is actually really, really important.
Thank you. And then here's another sort of general question related, in fact, back to member communications. This is from Arshad Khan. What are the key messages that trustees should be relaying to help protect members? And are there differences between actives, deferreds, and pensioner members, which is the thing which I think is new in this question compared to what you were saying before?
Yeah, so for pensioners, we have asked trustees, administrators to prioritise continuing pensions, so that pensioners shouldn't have concerns that their pension's not going to be paid in the future. For active members, the message is keep saving if you can afford to. We do want employers to hand over contributions to investment managers and have those contributions invested in a timely way. I think for actives and deferreds, beware of scam activity. Don't get drawn into making a decision that you'll regret down the road.
Thank you. Now thank you, David. So as I said, there's still quite a few more questions that have been raised. We won't be able to cover them all now, but what I thought we might do for the last 5 or 6 or 7 minutes of the webinar would be to take a step back from the immediate world of COVID and guidance and look out through the rest of the year. And I know from talking to David that TPR still has a kind of good BAU agenda that they want to work through for the rest of the year. And some of the questions are related to this as well. I wonder, David, if you could tell us a little bit about the TPR's major plans for the rest of the year in terms of substantive proposals and initiatives.
Yeah, so we did have a number of initiatives on the go, which we've had to defer and come back to later in the year. So things which are really important to us and we think important to the pensions industry. So things like ESG, climate change. Within the pension schemes bill, you've got the requirement for large pension schemes to be defined to have financial disclosures in accordance with TCFD guidance. So climate change, ESG is still really important to us. Personal passion of mine is around diversity and inclusion. With our consultation, we did set out some thoughts on how we might take that forward. We are going to come back to those. And of course, we've still got our funding consultation out there, which we hope to conclude towards the end of this year.
Thanks, Dave. Now, one of the questions, several of the questions actually were about the Trustee Toolkit. One of them's from Kirsty Robb. So this is saying the Trustee Toolkit is very useful, and it'd be good to hear what other plans you have for it for the rest of the year. And someone else was asking a little bit earlier, in particular, are you planning to give any extra guidance on ESG issues? And also the observation, when updates are made to the toolkit, it would be great if you could publicise those. So what are your plans for the Trustee Toolkit, David?
Yeah, I mean, so we had some very good, very strong plans to improve the toolkit. So I think responses to our consultation last year around trusteeship and governance, everyone loves the toolkit, finds it incredibly informative and helpful. But there is a recognition that it doesn't deal with some of the more current issues such as ESG, such as diversity and inclusion. So it does need to be updated. As soon as we can apply the resources to do that, then we'll be taking that forward. Yeah, so later in the year, hopefully you'll hear from us.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Now, were there any final points that you wanted to make to the 300 plus members of the pensions community gathered on this call before we hand back over to our host, Rachel?
So you'll have seen the guidance that we've put out. We've tried to make that as comprehensive as we can. To the extent you think further guidance is required, or any guidance that we've put out is is not clear, then please do get in touch with me. We'd love to hear from you, and we'll try and help and support each other through these difficult times. But thank you to the PLSA for giving the opportunity to respond to questions and set out some of our thoughts. It's really appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Rachel.
Well, thank you very much, David and Nigel. You've gotten through quite a lot of material there, but we had a ton of questions, which is great. And as a reminder, we are going to continue to answer these questions, and we'll send them around as a follow-up. Thanks, everyone, for joining today.